All right. So, shall we start the webinar today? Hope everyone can listen to my voice. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are so thrilled to have you all joining us today. My name is Hyun-Young Yoon, an adjunct professor, Seoul National University. It's my distinct honor to be the moderator for today's webinar. So on behalf of Global R&D Center at Seoul National University and UNPOG, I'm very happy to welcome you to our second webinar from our Governance Capacity Development Session series. So as you know, this webinar series started from last week and will run to June 25. Okay, so the theme of today is infusing ESG principles into smart city development and sustainable city governance. So this session will focus on how the principles and framework of ESG can be applied to the whole smart city implementation project through infusing the spirit, the core principles, and the best practices of ESG into envisioning, planning, architecting, and implementing such smart cities. And also this session will cover how the smart city management based on ESG principles can be governed through the establishing the holistic framework with engagement of all stakeholders, including municipal agencies, civic service entities, civil society organizations, private sectors, and citizens. Okay, so to discuss about this topic, we invited two honorable speakers today whose work reflect all the best experiences at academia and society. Our first speaker, Professor Jun-Seok Hwang, is going to discuss what are the infusing ESG principles into smart city development. And then our second speaker, Professor Martin Weiss, is going to discuss what is smart for whom on the governance of smart city infrastructure. And we have 30 minutes for each lecture. And after that, we have 20 minutes for question and answer. And I welcome you to type any questions or comments throughout today's session in the Q&A box. Okay, so then let me introduce the first lecturer today. Professor Jun-Seok Hwang, Director of Seoul National University Global R&D Center and Director of Transdisciplinary Graduate Program in Smart City Global Convergence. Professor Jun-Seok Hwang is currently leading various meaningful initiatives on smart green digital transformation of cities, business ecosystems, and global societies with energy, passion, and vision to actively implement the goals and objectives of Sustainable Development Goals. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jun-Seok Hwang.
Thank you very much, Professor Hyun-Young Yoon, for your kind introduction for me. And so I'd like to check, do you see my slide, Professor Yoon?
Yes, I can see you well.
Okay, yeah. I greatly appreciate, all of you who participate in this, UNPOG and SNU SDG special talk session. I see the people from Greece, Emmanuel, and it's very nice to see you back again. I have a people from Nepal and Namaste, and so for some of you, good morning and good afternoon. Today I'm going to actually talk about very important, the value system, which we these days call ESG, and how such environmental and social and governance values and principles can be infused into, when we practice in a smart city development, which is also very important task, for our new generation who are preparing for the future. So I will frame my talk, with some very integrated and also converged view, how we have a kind of integrated infusement, from the top down and bottom up approach, which I'll tell you more in detail. When we want to accomplish some of the goal and achievement, from environmental values and social values and governance values. So let me start. So, for some of you, smart city is a new topic. And so I'd like to start with a little bit of introductory, philosophy, and then my definition of what the smart city would be and how we can look the relevance, the importance of smart city development, like when we see the evolution and the beginning of the internet development, when that was, as one of the pioneering infrastructure we have these days. So I see smart city in such view, and I will tell you why. The secondly, and I will talk to you the ESG value creation, how my view of ESG value when we consider as smart city development. Especially, I'm going to mention about SDG 11, which is resilient and sustainable urbanization and community building. And so I will relate, my talk, in this SDG too. Thirdly, my view of, integrated ESG infusement in a top-down and bottom-up will be introduced in my third part of my talk today. And finally, I'm going to share with you some practical example which I'm exercising now as a practitioner at the same time as a professional and professor, and doing, ESG practices as a smart city development in Korea and worldwide, and also in our university. And finally, I'll give you some closing remark of the summary, which I'm going to give you. So, what is smart city development? Well, I think, if you see that, we have to understand what the smart is and what the city is and what the development is. From my point of view, realizing the ultimate truth of smartness and ultimate meaning and of the city. And finally, positive and constructive, the ways and practice for the development is truly in a smart city development. And let's go through, what that can be as an example, where we are living today. So in human settlement and civilization history, so, current city environments are mostly influenced by, Western, city development by ancient, Athens and Rome. And much of the street, the governance structure, the way we look and make a road were, based in many of those, even though they actually make a road on the road that used to be in their, in their community, but basic, the way of governing and managing the city were based in such a, Western, culture. So which I would say Athens and Rome. At that time, we have, the meaning of the polis in Rome, and there's the time we have a meaning of the agora. So polis is, one term that, also gives the urban and suburban, kind of categorization depending on, how integrated, with the facility and also governance and the core infrastructure existing in urban and suburban is surrounded that. And also, if that focused on the large scale public infrastructure, like a water supply and other system. And finally, our street and road and how the people move around within the city. And so those are defined by the police. And also at the same time, as a platform meaning of the Agora was the place with the square, market square, and also shared places where the people can gather. And those can be used for the many different purposes, community communication exchange, for the political uses in later, for the civilization, and also so for certain, there's no one purpose defined, but basically it allowed the people together and exchange and also share the common value and common identity, as a society. That was the meaning of the, kind of the city, the essence. So in both of that, as a city, the technology and tool were infrastructure. And people, were, kind of using those tech. And finally, we want to actually create the culture, knowledge, and science, which will, allow, higher level of innovation, higher level of the development, or, something, dragging back down the future faster than other part of the community or the country, than that, this thing, the city, from, existing other, rural towns and village. So where city, you probably have a more advanced or more completed integrated value. That was the, kind of the concept of the city. The reason is there were more people, there were diversity associated, and they were free from ethnic, and that was the one. Now, and because of such kind of civilization, also now, bring us to, kind of very heavily use of the computer and internet and the technology associated with it, something we call smart technology, which includes smartphone, IoT, AI, big data, right, cloud computing and blockchain, 5G. And these days, more of that, autonomous vehicle. So, or, probably I think, smart logistics or smart shipping. So smart factory and other things. So, the in the city, we have a complex set of the life and the job, the living and sleeping and eating and moving and playing, gathering, and all sort of things are solved by, many of using the, infrastructure, which are based on data and also connect and content, something we call the platform. So those city now, considered to be city as a platform, which is actually very advanced meaning of the smart city, in addition to the connection of the data, and it creates new ways of the value creation by combining a lot of values and innovation in addition to the people and organization. And there are very agile interactive development possible. And for that reason, we create some partnership innovation concept, which stands for public-private people partnership. And such kind of innovative partnership, capability of shared data and trust data allow us, to bring to more of another, output as a sustainable innovation, which is probably one of the most important aim of, city. Because, many cities are now, strengthened by its, by its sustainability. There's such sustainability, not only about the infrastructure or energy and environmental value, but social values of the sustainability. And finally, also governance are not sustainable in many of the things. And so we want to actually have a more sustainable innovation, which allows to have a more peaceful and also for planned and expectable life of living, which gives planning better. So here, some of the examples that was smart city development is, basically we want to solve the practical problem of the urbanization. There were, the parking problem in all the city in the world, and now they want to, one of the primitive solution is having another parking place, a new space. That's the old way. And also probably because some water also supply, the pipes are getting more than 50 years and 100 years, some of them, but you don't know where it is lacking. And so such kind of, where it's leaking, the water is leaking, we don't know. Such a lack of information is very difficult to manage. Sometimes you have to change the whole the infrastructure that make us, a lot of cost, and because of the cost, not many city and municipality and government would be able to manage those things properly. For that reason, we want to have use the technology and smart and data, and to have a real-time monitoring. Finally, have proper parking places with proper alignment, and finally also real-time sensor and monitoring for the water leakage. And finally, you react onto the problem we are having, and that makes us better, more agile in innovation. At the same time, smart city is something for the future. We not only solving the problem, but we always something want to do better than now. We try to utilize such kind of our hope and fact we are dealing with, and to be used for the more of ideal use of the fact which we say, and the idea become the real business and practice of life. And then we need to get a data. And there are many ways of we are getting the data, because people are, around and with the internet, IoT and smartphone, and a lot of, smart appliance, and even wearable computing. And many of those are, all the say, even wall and smart wall. And so, you don't know where the sensor is, and the best technology is invisible. And because of invisible technology, we would be able to have a datafication. Finally, that such data will allow us to have a city data collection. And then availability of the city data collection is, if you have a proper trustness, within your society, and proper protection for the privacy, proper protection for the, the security, and then that higher level of the trust allow us to have a more freedom of using data. Finally, such freedom can be used as a real freedom of the people. And finally, the real freedom of people will allow the real innovation of democratic system. And so, such kind of will give a service, for the application. Finally, it will improve the smartness, and then everyone can live an everyday life better. And living together is much easier, much more comfortable. And then, then this city will have a growing number of the population, because they how to live together. And this growing number of population is not necessarily, categorized by the physical boundary of the smart city, but virtual boundary of the economy and data. And that is, you have a higher level of population, and then you have a platform. So I'm not going to actually talk about all these innovation theory. When we are explaining about the smart city development, we explain them with some of the important new theory which I actually teach in my class. Generative innovation system stands for global, national, and regional innovation system to be integrated together and toward to the human capability. So I will, these are, one of the way that you can look and design and the idea and concept of the smart city. New open innovation, not only in the form level of product and procedure, but in the more institutional level of the innovation and public level of innovation, then this open innovation thinking is really important. And these now going toward the open data, open technology, and open services. And also social technical innovation, not only the technical innovation, but social adaptation is very important. I think Professor Martin Weiss might deal with his center, who are dealing with very of these information, actively, and the center is one of the leader, organization in such area. I hope you will get a lot, of very advanced state of our activity, what the University of Pittsburgh is doing. And also data-driven innovation, very important. Now, data is the virtual set of the fact. So data, we really respect the fact, and such, fact, could be, well used when the fact are not changed, not distorted, and then we want to use that factive data, for the, innovation. Then that we call the data-driven innovation. Finally, utilizing this one, we want to have people to create the job. We want people to create their, insight, their institution. These are the entrepreneurship. So, in new smart city development, one of the main achievement is what kind of new kind of job, in that city has, how the citizens are working over there. And there, what are the ways they make their money and living and business, and what the value they pursue in their enterprises. And can we make it everyone to be the owner, ownership and citizenship, and they have the ownership right on every innovation possible. And so that is our view of what the smart city should be. Now, I'm going to move on to the second part, ESG value creation in smart city development. I want you to be, going back to, UN SDG website and see, what SDG 11 is. It is about the sustainable, smart city, and it's about, and so they said, actually, make cities and human-centered, inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And as you can see, that they are talking about many of, safe affordability by innovation, affordable sustainable transportation by innovation, inclusive and sustainable urbanization by innovation, protect the world cultural heritage and natural heritage by innovation, reducing adverse effect of the nature by innovation, reduce the environmental impact of the city by smart city, provide the access of the safe, inclusive, green, and public infrastructure by. These are all of kind of potential bottom up, or some of the things that you can do. At the same time, as a top down, you would be able to infuse smart city, the national regional planning, about the smart city development, because the smart city is not only for the developed countries or highly technical countries. They can actually optimize the way of adopting smartness, if they have strong trust about the vision. Implement the policy for inclusion and disaster reduction, and this one is also very important. The top down and leadership on the smart city and vision. Finally, also having support for the developed countries, least developed countries, and for the sustainable buildings in practice. So yes, these are very important, but I'd like to synchronize UN SDG, which only have 10 years left. That Korea has another next 5 year commitment on which can be synchronized UN SDG, which I will say K New Deal or Korean New Deal. So which actually try to come up with some environmental value and social value and governance values. And you can see a leading economy with governance and low carbon environment, and also inclusive society and things like that. You see the ESG there. So we actually have a lot of effort to do research and innovation, and then also development. There are 10 representative tasks of Korean New Deal. So these there are very infused meaning of the ESG. So ESG, what we are standing for, is not the best meaning of the ESG. We were more of a proactive ESG building that recovering and preparing and planning environment, right? And social values are newly created, not only responsibility. And then finally, and then the social transformation can happen, and society actually improve the shared the identity among, and increase diversity associated. Finally, innovation and governance, same thing. Achieving the goal of the society through the better government and governance, and then everyone has stronger rights and the democracy and citizenship. That is the goal. And thirdly, and I'd like to actually give you a shot that, I've been actually, doing some master planning for the smart city of the Siheung smart city in Korea, which is one of the national city. And then, I identified 10 areas of the factor. And out of that experience, actually, I made this actual chart, by myself, for me to give you kind of what is top-down ESG investment, into smart city development. When we consider smart city, from the aspect of smart city development, and then as a top-down, I would say, yeah, smart city is still smart infrastructure and the platform, as I mentioned. Okay, I have a view of a top-down, then I can describe smart city is platform. In such kind of view of the smart city, definitely you need to have a something, action, about national vision and strategy, and digital diplomacy, where you can actually identify, global innovation partner, or, someone who can strengthen, digital capability. And because you cannot have all the capability of the smart city at once, you need to share and cooperate, with the data, technology, and commercialization of it. And finally, also global open innovation, making your regional, city to be more global by the data and the fact, because I don't believe any city, any one city can solve its own problem by itself. That's why there should be a platform. There should be a, shared innovation. There should be something, together. So finally, the outcome in general, for the smart city are, very obvious, for the environmental value, enhanced living and social shared in their identity and governance, goal achievings are possible for everyone. And more of the public, more of, popular and universality you get in the governance and the goal achieving, then your smart city development from the top down point of view, it's actually possible. So the view that you make in a smart city, from the top down is making current city to the much smarter, which is smart city. In such action, the environmental value infusions are in the value system of action, not only the protection, but planning, projection, and preservation. At the same time, for the social value infusement, not only social responsibility, but R&D support with the knowledge base, rebuild, and regeneration. Finally, not only the governance infusement is actually exercise can be not only about the governance infrastructure, the shared structure, but also shared data, a shared strategy, finally shared innovation. These principles are very important, if we want to have a good top-down infusement. But always, top-down is not, depending on what stage you are in, depending on the scope, sometimes you do top-down infusement, sometimes you do, the bottom-up. So here we have in the bottom-up infusement, smart city, ESG. And from my point of view, ESG principle, smart city as a bottom-up is a smart citizenship. Smart city cannot be stands, without smart citizenship. For such purposes, we need to deal with education with convergence, smart convergence, and and also we need to deal with the people with the smart freedom, higher level of the freedom. We need to, deal with the vocation, with the smart, literacy, smart tech literacy, data literacy, technology literacy, you name it. But the vocation involved the innovation, for the smarter value. Because I believe smart city only stands, when your citizens call, your city is smart enough. And when your citizens are called by other cities, they are the smart citizen. Such smart citizenship building is the beginning point of the smart city building. So instead of looking for the infrastructure, someone to build for you by the business, by the government, by foreigners, by businessmen, no, you got to build your own city. That's our philosophy of, having pioneerism and entrepreneurship and also development and also in smart city, professional. So but the goals are now we are expecting the same. Environmental requires, it will, value will lead us to enhanced living, and so, social, infusement will lead us to shared identity, finally, goal achieving. So, as a bottom up, citizenship is the base. And then you got to educate, you got to have a higher level of communication, you got to have a higher level of trust. And finally, such kind of smart citizenship building are done by the bottom up and from the people, and also self-governed, community. Finally, they are the one then who will develop and build and create the smart city. The infusement action of the environmental and social governance are a little bit differently elaborate here. So environmental infusement for the smart city development, include, living lab with sustainability or environmental entrepreneurship, natural sustainability development, finally global and local value for ecological balance and diversity. Secondly, social infusement, include also, cultural diversity enhancement, public-private people partnership, activity and community practice building in your society by a lot of knowledge exchange and virtual engagement, and improve justice and also value system are the one that you may pursue as a community or social infusement. Finally, the governance, the infusement require us, more in a democratic population with the freedom. At the same time, such kind of democratic population should see the fact by the data, and which say that data-driven governance with the democratic population participants. Finally, many of those decision-making and data and governance should be open and transparent of the citizenship. Finally, that will lead us to the public innovation. That's where the technology, innovation, and science meets with governance and public policy. And so yeah. And engineering, innovation, and public policy are not separable issues in this smart city development, and you got to actually understand the philosophy behind it. And finally, I will share with you some of the example what we are doing. So as an example of generative innovations of smart city development, as I practice, I talk to you. And then, in Korea and in our Siheung, I'm involved with the Smart City Green Innovation System project, and which is part of the Siheung Smart City and Smart New Deal, where I create this master plan for them. And finally, also we acquire some New Deal, for the open learning center creation, which will allow a lot of retraining and transport to professional education by the university in many of the mobility and also logistics. And finally, also creating some kind of e-mobility platform in this area. And also, then this become a green, industrial and complex at the same time, the smart city. Another project we are involved because the openness, preaching is very important. So within our campus, we want to have a green innovation tower, and where everyone exchange and the new institutional building is happening. And just an hour ago, I have a meeting with the many innovation research institute in Korea, and have a meeting for the planning for the program where we will do as a going and as an education body of the going. At the same time, the innovation center, data-driven innovation with the ESG value. In my floor, we have a city lab, which is 806 and supported by the KAIA, which is a research organization of Korean Smart City, and they support us with the many Korean business partner, including KT, and we create this city lab places. This is the beginning of the places where this city lab will evolve as a, the innovation center. Finally, actually, which will pursue a lot of ESG value creation and infusement ESG into the smart city development. At the same time, smart city, smart entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship does not necessarily need to the private entrepreneurship, public entrepreneurship. So where you need, very pioneering imagination, innovative insight, inspiration, and design thinking. And having them to be not only loose as an individual, but connected to them a lot of social organization and create opportunity, and finally to the people. That will allow them to do another capacity building. Finally, such kind of connectivity involved within our entrepreneurship ecosystem will allow to have their own trees and own outcome. Where that when these trees comes through, you need still consistent environment like a water and temperature, but still you need some level of dynamics. The society need to be dynamic, and which will create the creativity by its diversity. Finally, because of innovations are very dynamic and also very fast, changeability and agile governance is very necessary. They have this kind of capacity to be in the professional capability. That is smart entrepreneurship. Finally, these entrepreneurs will pursue some of the thesis, for that. But we structure them as an education, as Smart City, graduate school. And this is, some of you who are attending here, or some of who want to start, I really recommend you to come to Korea and study this Smart City Global Convergence major. This is one of the pioneering research, and research at the same time, practical, professionalism, graduate program with the full scholarship, and many people will enjoy the platform we have and also the people we are having. We are also in very close collaboration with the University of Pittsburgh, or University, the Nevada, Reno, and many other international university. At the same time, some of the practical capability of organization who has some real practice of smart city. So we have a very strong industry academic cooperation project in action with many other cities, and having expect to have exchange and also the planning for the cooperation for the research and also the startup and entrepreneurs. This is my final one. That as an out-of-base, as also not only professor but as a practitioner, I designed the very important 10 large-scale project for the city. And these 10 action business models are in planning. Already some have already acquired the funding and started its actual practice and project for 5 years or longer term. And so, which actually have a span from autonomous e-mobility and up to the cultivating human capital for Industry 4.0. So, the 10th one, I already acquired $35 million, for the cultivating all these human resources by the support of the Ministry of Industry and also the Gyeonggi Province and Siheung Smart City. So these are the real actionable plan. I really love to share with you my experience over the time in my next talk. Some of the accomplishments I made. By hopefully this talk will continue in next semester, so that I can give you a little bit more changes I made and also share some of the achievement I have. Okay, I think I already used the time I have. Thank you very much for your attention. And I hope, we can have some Q&A, after, Professor Martin Weiss' talk. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you for the lecture, Professor Jun-Seok Hwang. It was a truly inspiring and insightful lecture. And also, thank you for keeping the time. Okay, now I'd like to introduce our second lecturer today, Professor Martin Weiss, Associate Director of Center for Governance and Markets, University of Pittsburgh. Professor Martin Weiss has been working for many years, governance, in and of technological systems as a professor, researcher, and practitioner. Recently, his research is focusing on governance in technological systems with blockchain technologies. And today, he's going to give a lecture, the title with Smart for Whom, on the governance of smart city infrastructure. So please join me in welcoming Professor Martin Weiss.
Well, thank you, everybody. Let me get my slides up. So yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. As Professor Yoon pointed out, I'm a professor both in the School of Computing and Information at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as the Associate Director for the Center for Governance and Markets, which is also housed at the university. At the Center of Governance and Markets, we take a very bottom-up approach to the world. We try to understand how people organize themselves to action, to preserve resources. So, I mean, again, this is a viewpoint, and as Professor Hwang pointed out, it's not the only one. Top-down planning is also necessary, but we're really interested in these ideas of organization, and so my presentation is very much infused with those values. So again, picking up on some of the ideas that Professor Hwang had talked about, we will really, in this presentation, I want to frame smart city technologies and investments as an infrastructure. And so there is a fairly substantial literature around infrastructure, and I will touch on some points of that, and I'll use some points of that in my argument. But I think the main point as we go into this is that infrastructure plays a very special role in society. It's a different role, as we will see. And this then leads us to ask, why should we think about governance of infrastructure? There are some academic theories that we'll go through. And again, we want to think about what the implications are for this strategic development goals. So I start with the challenge that when we talk about governance, we're not necessarily talking about government. And so I somewhat provocatively say that governance is not equal to government. And it's not necessarily so, right? So I will back away from that. But the point here is to get your attention and to start to get you out of the mindset that we're just talking about government. Certainly governments do implement certain governance functions, but again, built on the principles of bottom up that our center is interested in, we're not necessarily talking about government. So the second main idea is, and again, I mentioned it in the previous slide, is that we're talking about infrastructure. And then, indeed, many of the things that Professor Huang was talking about, sensors, data, even some of the physical aspects of it, those are infrastructures. Infrastructures in very general terms satisfy a number of criteria. And this is work that was done by Brett Frischman and published in 2005. So this is not a terribly new theory. First, an infrastructure is a resource that can be consumed non-rivalrously, or partially so. What that means when this idea of rivalrousness is an economic term, that basically means that when I consume something, you cannot consume it. So if you think about, going to the vegetable market, and when you buy vegetables or fruits, those items that you buy cannot be purchased by somebody else because you've purchased them. So your consumption is rivalrous. On the other hand, a fully non-rivalrous production are some so-called public goods. For instance, when we think about the national defense that a country offers, that's offered to all citizens, and my consuming of that does not at all diminish your consuming of that. So that's a classically not a non-rivalrous consumption. And this notion of partially so kind of I think applies a bit better to the smart city area, where if you think about roads, for instance, my use of a road does not, at least at some point, completely inhibit your ability to consume it. Now, if all of us start consuming it a lot, we get congestion. And in some urban areas, we see that kind of congestion. So that's a partially non-rivalrous type of consumption. Another thing, and this is actually a very important point, and Professor Huang touched on it a couple of times during his talk, is that the demand for the resource isn't direct. It's driven by downstream activity, which is what the resource is useful for. So you can think about the resource as an input to some other thing that is socially valuable. So again, you think about roads, for instance. Roads by themselves are not that valuable on their own, but they're valuable in the sense that they allow us to trade, they allow us to travel, they allow us to do other things that are socially valuable. So you have this one degree of indirection that occurs within infrastructure. The other thing is that the resource isn't specific to a particular thing, right? So we use roads for lots of things. We use roads to visit our friends. We use roads to carry goods. We use roads to transport emergency patients and so on. And so we use it for lots of different things. The services that are provided are sometimes private services. You know, when we get a package delivered, that's often anyway, a private service, at least in the US. And the other services are public services, public safety, for instance, and so on. I mean, I don't have to enumerate it, but we don't necessarily know what the resource is used for. But, you know, so Frischman's viewpoint framework is, I think, very interesting, but I don't think it's necessarily complete. Infrastructure can actually mean lots of different things. For example, laws and regulation are a kind of infrastructure. I was particularly interested in Professor Gillian Hadfield's book called Rules for a Flat World, in which she talks about the growth, the demand for regulation, the demand for laws and economic entity. So it's I think this is part of the infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure that we live on. Physical resources, of course, and this is what we're most familiar with, but cultural norms are also a kind of infrastructure, right? So, you know, when we live in our individual communities, there's things that we do, there's things that we say, there's things that we shouldn't do, and things that we can't say that aren't part of, you know, actual law, but they're part of the cultural norms that we live in. And it's these cultural norms, again, if you go back into evolutionary biology, these cultural norms exist for us to have a cohesive society so we can live together as a group. And there are other things too. So infrastructure can mean a lot. The other thing is that human behavior adapts to infrastructure. You know, once infrastructure becomes infrastructure, and again, that's an interesting point as to when that might occur or might not occur. As human behavior adapts, as we build infrastructure, we get this adaptation of human behavior. And this kind of cycle between human behavior and infrastructure is particularly interesting, and it's challenging, I think. And the last thing I want to say about infrastructure is mostly it's invisible to us until it breaks, right? So, you know, when we have to go to the grocery store, we don't think that much about the road. It's just there. We don't think about the pipes, the electric cables and so on that sits under the street, the internet that is making this happen. We don't think much about it until it doesn't work. So there's this notion of invisibility of infrastructure. And I think that becomes even more so when we think about cultural norms and these laws and regulations. In fact, the breaking of cultural norms comes when we have changes in society. And we've all, I think, experienced that where our social and cultural basis has transformed from one thing to another. So if we want to think about, there's a large literature on the social aspects of infrastructure, and this exists in the form of literature on what they call infrastructure studies. Edwards and his co-authors summarized a lot of some of the ideas from this. This particular paper is from a special issue from a journal that was devoted on this. So there's a few things that they they talk about, and I don't want to overemphasize it, but I thought I would touch on a couple of them. So when they think about infrastructure, they're really talking, they're looking at how infrastructure forms. And this has both short-term and long-term phenomena. Some of the things that, you know, when you're building infrastructure, this is especially true of infrastructure that's built in a bottom-up way. The actual construction often has relatively small scope, and it's meant for a relatively short term. But because of our human behavior change that goes with it, it has long-term consequences. So this balance between short-term and long-term is interesting. Same goes with scope. You know, it may be initially built for a small group of people, but it ends up expanding. This leads us to how do you get from this building phase? So in smart cities, for instance, we're very much about building infrastructure today. You know, so, you know, and Professor Huang has talked quite a bit about Shihong and his participation in it. And in fact, it's very interesting to see. I will, you know, encourage you all, if you have the opportunity, to visit what they're doing there. It's fascinating. But this idea of going from this building phase to a sustaining phase, that is, once it's built, how do you keep it going, is often institutionally difficult. Funding is challenging, for instance. People love to, you know, especially politicians like to build something because you can point to it, whereas funding an ongoing infrastructure is much less politically attractive. And the other thing that occurs is that the people who do the building often have different things in mind. They have different goals for themselves than people who sustain infrastructure. And so there are these transitions that have to take place that are often challenging. As we start, you know, so again, going back to the Shihong example, this is in a way, it's an island it's an intelligent island in a world that isn't as intelligent, right? So we can think of it almost as an infrastructure to be. As when the internet was first developed, it was an infrastructure to be. Today we depend on it in ways that we couldn't imagine because of COVID, but it wasn't always that way. I mean, initially it was an experiment between universities. And this is why we often start with smaller scales. There may be competing technologies involved. I mean, we all use the TCP/IP protocol now, but the path to adoption was a very long and curvy one. It wasn't a straight line. And a lot of times what we end up with is gateways between these islands. And that is an interesting phenomenon all of its own. So, you know, I can go through a lot of these kinds of things. Infrastructures, though, are not future-proof. Humans adapt to infrastructures, infrastructures adapt to humans. So these are the kinds of things that if you get into the literature on infrastructure studies, that you kind of take a look at. So to my main point, though, infrastructure isn't an end goal, it's an intermediate product. And because it's an intermediate product, it is often difficult to measure. And what I mean by measure in this case is more the economic and social value of the infrastructure. It's difficult to see because it's hard to observe directly. And part of the reason for this difficulty is that our behaviors are constantly adapting. You know, so the world in which we live is a very dynamic world. And so, you know, we're responding to our things. And as humans, we make use of tools. Infrastructure is one of those tools. And so we respond to our personal challenges by making use of the infrastructures that we have. mean, we've seen this in the COVID restrictions that many countries in the world have faced, that with changes in demand, we've changed our behavior, and often very, very abruptly so. But how did this affect demand for infrastructure? Well, it's hard to say. It's hard for us to say now what the post-lockdown world is going to look like for a lot of us. The bottom line is that because it's an intermediate product, there's a very challenging information problem that we have to face. The other thing is that infrastructures often feature declining average cost to scale. That means that the bigger they get, the lower the average cost is. So, you might say, oh, that's good, we'll just make them really big. And that's what actually often happens. But from an economic perspective, this is really challenging because optimal pricing for these infrastructures are often built on marginal cost pricing. And if you do that, then this declining average cost to scale means that we will run into a business that runs a loss. And so we have to find a way to price this fairly and in a way that's also sustainable. So all of these words kind of are captured in this picture. So we have infrastructure, which is a platform for user activities. And I really liked when Professor Huang used the word platform, because I think it's an important concept for us to think about. And it's, and so this notion of infrastructure as a platform, but also government as a platform. Tim O'Reilly some years ago was talking specifically about this idea of government as a platform. It's an interesting concept. So the infrastructure becomes a platform for user activities, and these are commercial, private, public, all kinds of different things that produce social outputs. These outputs are sustain this user. So if you're a business, for instance, you're interested in doing things that produce economically valuable activity, and the more you do it, you get this positive feedback circle. It feeds back on itself. But you notice in this initial cycle, it doesn't really get to infrastructure. Where infrastructure play comes is that these outputs have spillovers. And that's actually an economic term, right? So it's not just the user activities that benefit, but society benefits. We all benefit from many of the outputs. When you think about for example, on the internet, many of us use social media like LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook. Those are valuable for Facebook, but they're also valuable for society as a whole. And so the question is, how do you capture some of those spillovers and feed it back into infrastructure? So because of some of these goods, I will take the argument, and again, this is largely due to the viewpoint that we've made from the center. We tend to think of infrastructure as fitting a lot of the attributes of the commons. In economics, there are four major types of economic goods, and this is one of the innovations that Professor Ostrom made in her career, and it's one of the things that won her the Nobel public and private goods. And that's kind of what I was talking about when I was talking about the idea of rivalrousness. Private goods are the vegetables at the market. Public goods are things like national defense and perhaps roads. They're determined by the rivalrousness, which is across the top, and the cost of exclusion. In private goods, it's relatively easy to exclude. If I buy vegetables, they become mine, and it's relatively easy for me to exclude other people from having them. Whereas for other things, it becomes difficult to exclude. And this is one of the characteristics of public goods. When they talk about toll goods or club goods. This is theory that was developed in the early 60s. These are things like movie theaters that you can't catch. And so we think of, we tend to think of infrastructure as a commons, because when I start, mostly as a commons, I should say, because it's hard for me to exclude people from roads. I mean, we do it, we have tolling and stuff like that, but that's not really an exclusion. And, as I consume it, it affects your ability to consume it. So we think that this common pool goods is an interesting framework for thinking about governance and or infrastructure as an economic good. I should mention here that commons doesn't mean open access. Open access is one of the mechanisms that we can use for that. So if we don't have, we've all heard of the tragedy of the commons. One of the things that Ostrom spent her entire career focusing on was that the tragedy of the commons isn't a necessary outcome. Tragedy of the commons occurs when you don't have governance, right? So you need some way of managing access so that we can maintain the resource for the long term. And I think this notion of maintaining the resource over the long term is exactly what we need to think about when we think about the ESG principles as they apply to smart cities. So that's the economics. Like socially, we have these notions of fairness that are often culturally very dependent. And so I don't really want to dwell on them too much. But we want to be able to support an adequate supply of infrastructure. Again, this is from an economic kind of a view. So how many roads are enough? If we build one road, that's probably not enough. If we have our entire surface of the earth paved with roads, it's probably too much, right? So there's some balance between the number of roads that we have versus the number of roads that we need. And I think it's also important to align these things with social goals and preferences, and this varies regionally and by country, right? And I think this is one of Frischman's particular insights to me anyway, was that private owners of infrastructure, and I know not all infrastructures are privately owned, but those who do have a benefit for engaging or building a governance infrastructure for that, because they don't know what the infrastructure is used for. And so they want to be able to maximize the value that they get out of it. And so because they don't know what it's for, it's you kind of have to have the user engagement to figure out how to structure the infrastructure. And you don't want to foreclose future activity. So I want to say a little bit about what Ostrom found when she looked at common pool resource governance. The interesting body of her work was that she built a framework for data collection that went across these common pool resource systems. And so she could look at successful CPR, common pool resource systems, and see what kind of governance worked. And so what she found was that that resource systems that were small and had well-defined boundaries worked well from a governance standpoint. Whoops, I've gone over. If the groups that used them were also relatively small, had clearly defined boundaries, and all of these different characteristics, that turned out to be useful. That there was a strong overlap between the location of the users and the resources. In other words, these resources weren't being governed by people who were really disassociated with the resource. It was very much a lot, you had this synergy between people and the resource that was important. The institutional arrangements, so in this sense, and I'm using the word institutional in a very economic sense. So these are the rules that govern So these are easy, what Ostrom found was that if the arrangements were, clear, easy to understand, that the way in which you use and access the resource was determined by the people who are actually using it, that it's relatively easy to enforce, et cetera. I mean, there were a bunch of different attributes like that. I know I don't have the time to really elaborate on them. We want to be able to have some way of excluding people that's not expensive. And we'd like to have a good relationship with government, right? So we have this relationship between governance and government, and we can't dispute it. In fact, Ostrom specifically focused, both Eleanor and her husband, Vincent, focused on this notion of nested levels of governance. This is what they call polycentrism, where we have different locuses of control. So it's not, we don't have the national government coming in and determining how local things should be used, because the national government really has no idea how people are actually using an infrastructure. You see this, I'm sure, played out in many ways in your local communities. So this gets us to the question of smart for whom. This is the challenge that I posted in the title of the slide. And so from all this, we learn that infrastructure owners may have different objectives than infrastructure users, and that these are sometimes in conflict with each other. And so this conflict really gets to the heart of, smart, who benefits from smartness. We've seen in many of our lives, if not in our own countries, that we have governments that benefit from smartness in ways that citizens don't appreciate. In fact, Orwell's book 1984 was a classic example of where we had, a great deal of smartness in the hands of the government, but not so much in the hands of the people who were being governed. That's this, I think that highlights this idea of smartness for whom. The challenge is that users are often not aware of the consequences of this new smart infrastructure. So what does it mean for them? They can't really tell you. And the other thing that makes it challenging is, as I said, social norms are dynamic. So I think the good news is governance affords us the opportunity to bring competing objectives and preferences into a stable configuration. They don't have to be into alignment, just into a stable configuration. There's a difference. Alignment means agreement. A stable configuration means that we have an understanding with each other. If we have governance, we have the opportunity to learn. Because the governance system itself should be able to adapt to changing social preferences. So, users can learn about the capabilities of their systems, and owners can learn, infrastructure owners can learn about new applications and uses that can increase the value of their investment. And so, we like to focus on successes, but, in fact, failures might be a more interesting thing to study, especially from this point of view of theory. So these are things, I don't want to call them conclusions, but, I call them parting thoughts, because, these are things that we should think about going forward. And at Center for Governance and Markets, that's what we're doing. We've really embraced a lot of Eleanor Ostrom's ideas to foster to understanding these socio-technical problems. And as I mentioned several times, we take a very much bottom-up perspective. That's not to diminish the importance of top-down planning of the kind that Professor Huang talked about, and he in particular talked about the balance of top-down and bottom-up, and I think that's an important perspective. And as with GRC, we have a network of global partners that makes this easy. And what we really want to do is understand how these rules affect the ability of communities to engage in collective action around smart cities. So thank you very much. I hope I stayed in time. I'm not really sure. I wasn't paying attention.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay, so thank you for the wonderful lecture, Professor Martin Weiss. I think it was great opportunities to think about various aspects of infrastructures and also some governance. So thank you, both of professors. So now we have our Q&A session. We have a number of questions that was sent in prior to the webinar, but I also see a lot of questions coming in to our Q&A box here. So I think we have a 20 minutes, almost 20 minutes for the Q&A. So I will choose 2 questions for each professor first. Then if we still have our time, then we will discuss about more questions, okay? So I found some interesting questions from the Q&A box. Here is from, Kotuna Thomas. He actually raised the question like where the developing countries should begin when thinking of where it's gone. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, I think the question is gone. Okay, so let me find another question, which is also very interesting. So this is question for the Professor Huang, and from Christine. Question is, what are the challenges that you have encountered in the planning and execution of Siheung Smart City? And what are the new features of Siheung Smart City from other cities in Korea? So Professor Huang, would you please?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Christine. And so as a professional working with the community on this very important task, of the planning, official planning of the smart city development for the very official national city. And so it was very responsible and challenging, and no excuse for the failure in general. So I took much of time for trust building, and for me to have the trust building is about the interaction and communication and living together. So actually 2 years ago, I actually moved all my the task and the living condition around the area, especially and working environment, and try to learn the society. And also, so it was not as a consultant, as a citizen. I tried to be the citizen of the Siheung, but still, I don't know history. I'm new to the area, and then but I have to exercise my professional language with the people with the different languages, but I still need to learn, and then so. But such trust building turns out to be a great return as an actionable plan. So now the like a 10 business model I come up with, are based on the top down and bottom up, and many of the people who are in charge of this planning within the municipality and within the city government, they know the languages and they know how to support it. And so such trust building really took more than almost 2 years for me to still, but there's a great return out of it. If you have with the trust and the communication and understanding is much better. I don't think planning is the all. These plans can be changed over the time when technology changes, when situation changes and priority changes. But these are the one, in any point they can start at this moment, and they have a consensus, and their city Congress actually have also, aware of it, and the mayor officially actually, plan to announce it. These are all the trust. So the trust building as a planner, as your group, is important. But there are many different ways to create the trust. But without trust, you would not be able to have a successful master plan. But with the trust, you would be able to have a successful planner. And that was one thing. The most featureable thing is it's a combination of the new development at the same time regeneration. There's not generally the government support the only the regeneration part, but our Seoul National University by our self actually innovative and transformative action to build a new city innovation district that allow us to do the new development of the smart city. So both top down and bottom up and experience are really balanced here, which makes us unique and that compared to, so which we believe we can actually accomplish some experiential outcome for the citizen. They can say, yeah, I'm living in the city, in a smart city. And that was our goal. I believe that will be the future. Experiential technology, experiential innovation of a smart city are some feature compared to the rest of part of the other city, which I believe. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Huang. And the next question is for the Professor Martin Weiss. I think it's from Elias Mashomba. His question is like, in Africa, most companies, government, or institutions establish own infrastructure due to different regions. This lead into less sharing, which result into high deployment cost as well as operating costs. So is there a cost-effective model for the development and implementation of smart city infrastructure, which motivated the sharing among entities?
Bowker and Edwards and company do talk about this. I mean, I think this problem of islands, infrastructure islands, which you refer to, is a very classic problem in infrastructures as they emerge. And again, because of I can't speak specifically to the country of the questioner, but I do know that in some parts of the world we have private companies that come in and build infrastructure for the purpose of, let's say, using a particular resource that is in that, whether it's minerals, whether it's agriculture, whatever it is. But they deploy this infrastructure really specifically for that area. They don't deploy it elsewhere. I believe that's the context that he had in mind. So again, I'm not a practitioner when it comes to many of these things. Unlike Professor Huang, I just study about them. I don't try to make it. So Bowker and Edwards talk about this notion of gateways between them. I think these are not perfect solutions either. I mean, there's costs to gateways. There are congestion costs, especially when it comes into that, right? Gateways are not the same as having everybody using the same infrastructure. And yes, you do have inefficiencies. But I think the fact of the matter is, without a large central investment, it's difficult to really build infrastructure in a different way. And I think every country, I know from the history of the United States, we've also had this very patchy infrastructure development early on in our history. Even in telecommunications, the story is not it's not like we came in and built something and it was done. It was very much an adaptation to local circumstances, kind of figuring out how to tie things together and eventually gradually harmonizing the technical aspects of the infrastructure to make use of it. And I think most countries would follow that pattern.
Okay, thank you, Professor Martin Weiss. Then back to Professor Huang. There is a lot of questions about smart citizens and citizens' participation. So here are the questions. how to achieve an effective citizens' participation in a PPP scheme. This is a question from Jorge from Ecuador.
Okay, citizenship is a very subjective value. I think no one there to measure, what is a citizenship, on that, when we are talking about smart, especially smart citizenship. So it's not by the territory, it's not by the, only one factor, the profession, and also education. There's no discrimination about it. But still, I talk, that what is most, I think I'd like to refer back to Martin White's question, smart for whom? So here, I'd like to raise sort of my point of the citizenship, smart for all. So inclusive and public value of infrastructure and as a smartness, no matter what is technology or data or common pool, right? And then toll, but such numbers, that we have been thinking behind that smart for all. As a public policy, universality, universal service and access associated to smartness are very important part. That used to be sort of very selective, and lucrative, goods, in the beginning. But, we are living in an age that we can use these technologies and innovation like our common goods. And for that reason, still I want to have, everyone, let's democratize the smartness, like we democratize internet. Let's make the smartness universal so that everyone, it's not free but affordable for everyone. But to make it affordable, then people need to have a way to live with smartness, right? Let their job to be more compatible with the smartness, and let their basic income to be covered by the data they actually share. And so we create the professionalism and that the smart become one of the environmental and job opportunity for the citizens. So where we have the people's role to contribute to the smart. Smart is actually contribute for the smart, for good and for all. And so, public-private partnership are in a way that professional knowledge from the public and private are, the shared already, where they have a different perspective, but finally share with the people. And then the language you have with the citizens would be, kind of more advanced and more, let's say communicatable, not advanced, so that, your knowledge, the interaction will allow to higher level of intelligence, which we call collective wisdom and collective intelligence. So that's what we are pursuing. And finally, PPP is very important model. But, I have a research on the open innovation with my PhD student. We realized many kind of developed world and have an R&D system which become very, old. And finally, those R&D not become the investment, but become the cost. So, that becoming the cost is that there's no reason for the public to subsidize or to promote it. But, it becoming a cost, R&D. There should be a, substantial, transformation about how we manage the R&D, innovation system. For that reason, this public-private partnership and creating different environment within the smart city, and then finally having the, the top-down approach, how to manage it, innovation better with R&D and also R&D business. And that's why, we still need to have a very important, public policy view as other smart city, as an innovation system, at the same time as a, public infrastructure. That's my answer to, like Jorge. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Yoon, may I follow up on Professor Huang's answer as well?
Yep.
Sure.
Sure. So, no, I think this is it's a great question. It's one that at the Center of Governance and Markets we're particularly interested in. My colleague at CGM, Professor Jennifer Murdazashvili, does a lot of work in has done a lot of work in Afghanistan, where government authority, central government authority is weak. The institutions are just weak, and there's a heavy reliance on customary governance, customary approaches, village elders, etc. And so one of the things that we learned from that is that as we think about governance, to really respect and take advantage of the existing social infrastructures, the customary approaches that are already there. If it means going to churches, if it means going to village meetings, whatever it is, and this can be a highly regional sort of a thing. So understanding, what the environment you're going into and trying to understand what people need and what people want and explain to them how the investments that you're making can help them with the objectives of their lives, that will tend to foster more engagement in the governance of the infrastructure. So anyway, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think it's gonna be our last question for today for Professor Martin Weiss. There is a question from Jo Yu-chan, Seoul National University student. So how can global institutions bring developmental agenda to state which might lack in necessary political infrastructure?
So no, it's a great question. And I guess, I will, if I look at it through the lens that we consider, that we focus on in Center for Governance and Markets, we have a very bottom-up approach. And so I'm not, I tend to not think about how do we take an international initiative and make it local, but rather try to understand what people need in the communities where they live. I mean, because this is in the end where it matters, right? It's not. I mean, I think we have to, at least again, and this is my perspective, I think about the UN development goals as a way of measuring, and it's measuring progress towards social goal. But we can't go in and at least in my opinion, we can't easily go into a place, especially where governmental institutions are weak or unstable, and tell people what they need because the UN said so. We have to go in and find what it is that they need in order to make their lives better. What kind of infrastructure components? How much smartness do they need right now? What can they handle? What can they take advantage of? Because if they can't take advantage of an infrastructure that you're building, then it's truly a waste. So thank you.
Okay. There are still many questions, but if you really want to discuss with both professors, please email to them, and I'm sure, even though they are very busy, they will kindly answer for your question. Okay, so we really appreciate both professors for your time today on this really fascinating topic. And thank you all for joining us on this webinar. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
But for all the participants, before we finish, lastly, I kindly ask you participate in the post-event survey for today's webinar. You can easily access through this QR code. So your participation will be very helpful to enhance the quality of the remaining webinar for us. Okay. So thank you again for your time and participation, and hope we will see you all next week. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you.